The sound of snapping twigs beneath her worn boots echoed through the Colorado forest as Theresa Jenkins stumbled over yet another route. Her vision blurring from exhaustion and tears, she refused to shed any more. 2 days, she had been wandering these mountains outside of Buffalo, a small settlement nestled in the foothills where she had arrived just 3 weeks prior to help her elderly aunt manage a boarding house. And now she feared she would never see civilization again. Her basket hung loosely from one arm, half filled with what she hoped were the right medicinal herbs her aunt had sent her to gather. Though at this point, Theresa could barely remember what she was supposed to be looking for. The September sun filtered through the dense canopy of pines and aspens above, their leaves just beginning to turn golden, but the beauty of the landscape was lost on her as panic threatened to overwhelm her senses once more. She had been so foolish, wandering too far from the marked trail her aunt had described, convinced she had spotted a patch of wild feverfew just beyond the next cluster of trees. That had been 2 days ago, and since then, every direction looked the same. Her throat ached from thirst despite the stream she had found yesterday, the water cool and clear but doing little to ease the gnawing hunger in her belly. The few berries she had dared to eat sat uneasily in her stomach, and she prayed they were not poisonous. At 22 years old, Theresa had survived the journey west from Philadelphia after her parents passed from fever, had endured the rough coach rides and the stares of rough men in dusty towns, but this wilderness threatened to defeat her in a way nothing else had. She pressed forward, her green calico dress torn at the hem and stained with dirt and tree sap, her dark blonde hair falling in tangled waves from the pins that had long since disappeared. Just as she was about to sink down against another tree and give in to the exhaustion pulling at her limbs, a sound made her freeze. Footsteps. Heavy and deliberate, crushing the undergrowth with a weight that suggested someone much larger than herself. Theresa's heart hammered in her chest as she spun around, searching for the source, her mind conjuring images of bears or mountain lions or worse, the kind of dangerous men her aunt had warned populated these remote areas. "You are on private land," a deep voice rumbled from somewhere to her left, and Theresa let out a small cry of surprise as a man stepped out from behind a massive pine tree. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, partly tied back with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling shade of blue-gray that studied her with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple homespun shirt that strained across a chest and arms corded with muscle, and in his large hands he carried a rifle that looked almost small against his frame. "I did not mean to trespass," Theresa managed, her voice hoarse and trembling. "I am lost. I have been lost for 2 days." The man's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been concern flickering across his weathered features. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, his skin tanned from long hours in the sun, and there was a roughness about him that spoke of years living in these mountains. He took a step closer, and Theresa fought the urge to flee, knowing she had no energy left for running. 2 days, he repeated, his voice like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. "You should be dead." The blunt statement made Theresa's eyes widen, and to her horror she felt tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "I very nearly am," she whispered. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her torn dress, the basket clutched in her white-knuckled grip, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. Then he slung his rifle over his shoulder with practiced ease and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "My name is Pierce Jameson," he said, his tone gentler now. "You are gathering herbs." It was not a question, but Theresa nodded anyway. "My aunt sent me to find feverfew and yarrow. She runs a boarding house in Buffalo and uses them for remedies. I thought I saw some just off the trail, and then I could not find my way back." Pierce looked into her basket, then back at her face. "You found mostly weeds," he said, which made fresh tears spill over. "But you did get some yarrow mixed in. Come, I will walk you out." Relief flooded through Theresa so powerfully she thought her knees might buckle. "Thank you," she breathed. "Oh, thank you. I thought I was going to die up here." "You might have," Pierce said matter-of-factly. "Another night and you would have been too weak to walk." "These mountains do not forgive mistakes." He gestured toward the east. "Buffalo is that direction, about 8 miles as the crow flies. You have been walking in circles, judging by the signs I have been tracking." "Tracking?" Theresa asked, confused. "I spotted your tracks yesterday afternoon," Pierce explained as he began walking, his stride long but measured to allow her to keep pace. "I was checking my trap lines when I noticed boot prints that did not belong to anyone who knows these mountains. I figured someone was lost, so I have been following your trail to find you." The realization that this man had been deliberately searching for her made Theresa's chest tighten with emotion. "You were looking for me, but you did not even know who I was." Pierce glanced back at her, one dark eyebrow raised. "Did not need to know who you were to know you needed help. These are my mountains. I do not let people die in them if I can help it." They walked in silence for a while, Pierce leading the way through terrain that looked impassable to Theresa's untrained eye, but which he navigated with the ease of long familiarity. He moved through the forest like he was part of it, barely making a sound despite his size, while she crashed along behind him feeling clumsy and foolish. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked after a while, partly from curiosity and partly to keep herself focused on something other than her aching feet and empty stomach. 8 years, Pierce replied. "Came out from Missouri in 1868 after the war ended. Needed somewhere quiet." Theresa did some quick math in her head. That would make it 1876 now, which aligned with what she knew. The whole country was still recovering from the war, and she supposed the mountains would be appealing to someone seeking solitude. "You live alone?" "Mostly. Got a cabin about 3 miles from here. Hunt, trap, trade furs in Buffalo every few months." He paused to hold back a low-hanging branch so she could pass without getting hit in the face. "Do not need much else." The simple way he described his life intrigued her. Theresa had grown up in Philadelphia society, where people measured worth in social connections and material possessions, but this man seemed content with just himself and the wilderness. There was something almost noble about it, though she could not imagine the loneliness. "You not miss people?" she asked softly. Pierce was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "People are complicated, mountains are not." There was a weight to his words that suggested painful experiences, but Theresa did not pry. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, grateful beyond measure that she was no longer alone in this vast wilderness. As they walked, Pierce occasionally pointed out landmarks or plants, his voice taking on a different quality when he spoke about the forest. He showed her the difference between the yarrow she had been seeking and a similar-looking plant that would have made her violently ill. He pointed out game trails and explained how to tell direction by the moss on the trees and the angle of the sun. He moved aside vegetation to reveal wild strawberries, small but sweet, and waited patiently while she ate a handful that tasted like heaven after 2 days of near starvation. You know everything about these mountains, Theresa observed, licking the last of the berry juice from her fingers. A man learns what he needs to survive, Pierce replied, but there was something almost like pride in his voice. The land teaches you if you pay attention. My aunt says I do not pay enough attention, Theresa admitted. She says I am too impulsive, too quick to act without thinking. I suppose she was right, given my current situation. Pierce glanced at her, and she could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch beneath his beard. You are alive, which means you did something right. Most city folk would have drunk bad water or eaten poison berries by now. You have some sense in you. The unexpected compliment warmed Theresa more than it probably should have. I found a stream and only ate berries I recognized from illustrations in books, though I was not entirely certain they were safe. The stream you found was good water, Pierce confirmed. And the berries would not kill you, just give you a stomach ache if you ate too many. You have good instincts. They continued walking, the terrain gradually becoming less steep and the trees thinning slightly. The afternoon sun slanted through the branches, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and despite her exhaustion, Theresa found herself noticing the beauty around her. Perhaps it was the relief of being rescued, or perhaps it was the steady presence of the man leading her to safety, but the forest no longer seemed quite so threatening. "Tell me about your aunt's boarding house," Pierce said after a while, surprising her with the question. He did not seem like the type for small talk. "Aunt Margaret has run it for 15 years, Theresa explained, grateful for the distraction from her aching feet. "Since Uncle Thomas died, she takes in miners mostly, men working claims in the hills around Buffalo. She feeds them and does their washing and occasionally patches them up when they hurt themselves doing foolish things. That is why she needs the herbs. And you came from Philadelphia to help her. My parents died 6 months ago," Theresa said quietly. "Yellow fever. Aunt Margaret was my only family left, so when she wrote asking if I would come help her, I packed everything I owned and took the first coach west." She paused, then added, "I thought it would be an adventure." Pierce made a low sound that might have been amusement. "Is it?" Despite everything, Theresa felt herself smile. "It certainly has been interesting, though I admit I did not expect to get lost in the mountains within a month of arriving." "Buffalo is rough country," Pierce said. "Easy to get turned around if you do not know the land." "Your aunt should not have sent you out alone." "She did not," Theresa admitted. "She told me to go with Samuel, one of the miners who boards with us, but he wanted to leave at dawn and I wanted to sleep in, so I told him I would go later on my own. I thought I could follow his directions well enough." "Pride," Pierce observed. "Foolishness," Theresa corrected. "Though I suppose they amount to the same thing sometimes." They walked for another hour, the sun sinking lower in the sky and painting the clouds pink and orange. Theresa's feet were bleeding in her boots, and every muscle screamed for rest. But she forced herself to keep moving, determined not to slow their progress more than she already had. Pierce seemed to sense her struggle because he stopped more frequently, ostensibly to check their direction or point out some feature of the landscape, but really giving her a chance to catch her breath. As dusk began to fall, Pierce called a halt near a small clearing. "We will camp here tonight," he announced. "Too dangerous to walk these trails in the dark and you need rest and food." "But Buffalo," Theresa protested weakly. "Surely we are close, still 4 miles," Pierce said, already moving around the clearing with purpose, gathering deadwood for a fire. "You would never make it in your condition, not in the dark. Your aunt will have to worry one more night, but at least you will arrive alive in the morning." The logic was sound, and Theresa was too exhausted to argue. She sank down onto a fallen log and watched as Pierce built a fire with swift efficiency, his large hands working with surprising dexterity. Within minutes, he had flames crackling cheerfully, pushing back the gathering darkness. Then he disappeared into the trees, returning a short while later with several items Theresa realized he must have cached nearby. "You planned this," she said, watching as he produced a small pot, a water skin, and what looked like strips of dried meat wrapped in cloth. "I planned for the possibility," Pierce corrected, filling the pot with water from the skin and setting it near the fire. He added some dried herbs and the meat, creating a simple but fragrant stew. "When I am out checking traps, I keep supplies stashed at regular intervals. Never know when you might need them." "You really do know everything about surviving up here," Theresa said admiringly. Pierce shrugged his massive shoulders. "A man alone learns or dies. I chose to learn." They sat in companionable silence while the stew cooked, the firelight dancing across Pierce's angular features and making him look almost mythical, like some ancient warrior from the stories Theresa's mother used to read to her. She found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way the muscles in his forearms flexed as he tended the fire, the strength evident in every movement. There was something deeply appealing about his competence, his absolute certainty in this wild place. When the stew was ready, Pierce served her a generous portion in a battered tin cup he produced from his pack. Theresa burned her tongue in her eagerness to eat, but she did not care. The food was simple but tasted better than anything she could remember, warming her from the inside out and bringing back some much-needed strength. "Thank you," she said quietly, meeting Pierce's eyes across the fire. "For everything. For tracking me, for walking me out for this meal. You saved my life." Pierce looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, his gaze dropping to his own cup. "Anyone would have done the same." "I do not think that is true," Theresa said gently, "but I am grateful it was you who found me." They finished eating in silence, and then Pierce banked the fire slightly and gestured to a spot near it. "Sleep there. I will keep watch and make sure the fire stays lit. Temperature drops at night up here." Theresa wanted to protest that he needed rest too, but exhaustion was pulling at her so strongly she could barely keep her eyes open. She curled up where he had indicated, using her arm as a pillow, and felt Pierce drape something over her. His coat, she realized, still warm from his body and carrying the scent of pine smoke and leather and something distinctly masculine. The simple kindness of the gesture made her throat tight with emotion. "Pierce," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes. Why were you really looking for me?" "You said you do not need people, that you prefer the mountains." A long pause. Then his deep voice, soft in the night. "I prefer the mountains because they do not hurt you if you respect them. But that does not mean I want people to die in them. Sleep, Theresa. We have a long walk tomorrow." She wanted to say more, to tell him she understood something about loneliness and loss, but sleep claimed her before she could form the words. Her last conscious thought was of feeling safer than she had in 2 days, wrapped in a stranger's coat beside a fire he kept burning through the night. When Theresa woke, the sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink and gold. She sat up stiffly, every muscle protesting, and found Pierce feeding the fire and heating more water. He looked exactly as he had the night before, showing no signs of fatigue despite keeping watch all night. "How do you do that?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Do what?" "Stay awake all night and still look ready to walk 8 miles before breakfast." The corner of Pierce's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Practice. Here, drink this." He handed her a cup of what turned out to be pine needle tea, surprisingly pleasant and refreshing. "It will help with the stiffness." They broke camp quickly, Pierce erasing all signs of their presence with an efficiency that suggested long habit. Then they were walking again, heading steadily downward now as the terrain became less wild. Theresa's feet protested every step, but knowing they would reach Buffalo soon gave her the strength to keep going. As they walked, Pierce pointed out more features of the landscape, teaching her without seeming to, and Theresa found herself listening intently. There was something compelling about the way he spoke of the mountains, a reverence and understanding that went beyond mere survival skills. "You love it up here," she observed at one point. Pierce nodded slowly. "The mountains do not lie or pretend. They are what they are. There is peace in that." "What happened to make you need peace so badly?" Theresa asked gently, then immediately regretted it when she saw his jaw tighten. "I am sorry, that was too personal." But Pierce surprised her by answering. "I was at Shiloh," he said quietly. 23,000 casualties in 2 days. I watched friends die screaming, watched men do terrible things to each other. When it ended, I could not go back to pretending life was normal, so I came here." Theresa's heart ached for him. She had been too young to remember much of the war directly, but she had seen its effects on the men who returned, had heard the stories of battles that haunted survivors. "I am sorry," she said softly. "No one should have to carry those memories." "Everyone carries something," Pierce replied. "These are mine." They walked on, and Theresa found herself wanting to reach out and touch his arm to offer some comfort, but she sensed he would not welcome it. Instead she asked, "Do the mountains help?" "With the memories?" "Sometimes. Up here everything is simple. Hunt or starve, build shelter or freeze, stay alert or die. The present moment is all that matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Though lately I have found myself wondering if simple is the same as good." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, and Theresa saw him frown as if he had not meant to say that much. She tucked the knowledge away, this glimpse into the complicated man beneath the stoic mountain exterior. By mid-morning they had descended far enough that the trees were different, more scrub oak and pinyon pine than the high-altitude species from before. Then they crested a rise, and Theresa could see it in the valley below, the small collection of buildings that made up Buffalo, Colorado. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she stopped walking, just staring at the settlement with tears in her eyes. "We made it," she breathed. "We did," Pierce confirmed. "Another hour and you will be home." The word home felt strange applied to the town she had known for less than a month, but Theresa supposed anywhere with a bed and her aunt would feel like home right now. They started down the final stretch of trail, which was wider now and showed signs of regular use. Other people walked this path, bringing Pierce closer to the civilization he seemed to avoid. "You come to town often?" Theresa asked. "Few times a year." "Sell furs, buy supplies, then leave before too many people try to talk to me." He glanced at her. "No offense to your aunt, but I have no love for boarding houses and crowded streets." "None taken. Though I think you might be surprised. Buffalo is hardly crowded by Philadelphia standards. More dogs than people most days." They reached the edge of town just as church bells rang noon, the sound echoing across the valley. People were moving about their business, miners heading to and from the hills, women with baskets and shopping lists, children playing in the dusty streets. Several people stopped to stare at the sight of Theresa and Pierce walking together, the disparity in their appearances drawing attention. Theresa knew she must look terrible, filthy and disheveled with her torn dress and tangled hair, while Pierce looked like some wild man from the mountains, all muscle and leather and barely contained power. But she found she did not care about the stares. She was too relieved to be back, too grateful to be alive. "The boarding house is on Main Street," Theresa told Pierce, leading him through the town. "The one with the green shutters." They had barely reached the front porch when the door flew open, and a woman who must be Aunt Margaret rushed out, her face pale with worry. She was in her late 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that were currently filled with tears. "Theresa, oh thank God you are alive." Margaret grabbed her niece and held her tight, checking her over for injuries. "2 days we have been searching. Samuel felt terrible, thought it was his fault for not insisting you come with him. Where were you? What happened?" "I got lost in the mountains," Theresa explained, her own tears flowing now. "I wandered off the trail and could not find my way back. I would have died up there if not for this man. Aunt Margaret, this is Pierce Jameson. He tracked me, found me, and walked me out. He saved my life." Margaret turned to Pierce, who had hung back slightly, looking uncomfortable with all the emotion and attention. She studied him with shrewd eyes that seemed to take in everything about him in seconds. Then she stepped forward and took one of his large hands in both of hers. "Mr. Jameson, I am eternally grateful to you. Please come inside. You must be exhausted and hungry. The least I can do is feed you a proper meal." Pierce looked like he wanted to refuse, but Margaret was already ushering them both inside, calling for one of the boarders to heat water for baths. The interior of the boarding house was warm and welcoming, smelling of fresh bread and wood polish, with comfortable furniture and curtains at the windows. After 2 days in the wilderness, it felt almost overwhelming to Theresa. "I should go," Pierce said, edging toward the door. "You are safe now." "That is what matters. Please stay," Theresa heard herself say before she could think better of it. "At least for a meal. I would feel better knowing you had proper food after taking care of me." Pierce looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his blue-gray eyes. Then he nodded once, shortly. "1 meal. Then I need to get back to my trap lines." Margaret beamed and immediately began organizing, sending Theresa upstairs to wash and change while she prepared food for Pierce. Theresa wanted to protest, wanted to stay and talk more with the man who had saved her, but her aunt was not to be denied. She found herself upstairs in her small but comfortable room, stripping off her filthy clothes and washing with water that felt like liquid luxury. She changed into a clean dress of pale blue cotton, brushed and pinned her hair properly, and examined her reflection in the small mirror. She looked more herself now, though there were shadows under her eyes, and her face was thinner than it had been 3 days ago. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. When she came back downstairs, she found Pierce sitting awkwardly at the large dining table, looking like a wild animal trapped indoors. But he had washed his hands and face, and his hair was tied back more neatly, showing the strong lines of his face. Several of the boarding house's residents had gathered, curious about the mountain man who had brought Theresa home, and they peppered him with questions he answered in short, uncomfortable sentences. "Give the man space to eat," Margaret scolded, setting a plate of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables in front of Pierce that would have fed 2 normal men. But Pierce was not a normal man, and he made appreciative sounds as he ate that made Theresa smile. She sat beside him with her own plate, surprised to find she was ravenously hungry despite the pine needle tea and leftover stew from that morning. They ate mostly in silence, but it was comfortable, and Theresa found herself very aware of Pierce's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his large frame, the way his shoulder nearly brushed hers when he reached for his cup. When the meal was finished, Pierce stood to leave, thanking Margaret politely but firmly refusing her offers of payment. "I do not need money for doing what was right," he said. "Then at least take some supplies," Margaret insisted. "Coffee, flour, sugar, things you must knead up in those mountains." Pierce hesitated, then nodded. "Coffee I would take gratefully." While Margaret bustled off to prepare a pack, Theresa walked Pierce to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, and she found herself reluctant to say goodbye to this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. "Will I see you again?" she asked quietly. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Buffalo is small. We will likely cross paths." "That is not what I meant." He knew it was not. She could see it in his eyes. But he said nothing, just studied her face like he was memorizing it. Then Margaret returned with a pack of supplies, pressing it into his hands along with her thanks. And Pierce was heading down the porch steps and into the street. Theresa watched him go, her heart doing something strange in her chest. He moved through the town like he could not wait to escape it, his long strides eating up the distance, and then he was gone, disappearing up the trail that led back into the mountains. "That is quite a man," Margaret observed, coming to stand beside her niece. "He is," Theresa agreed softly. "Do you think he will come back?" Theresa thought about the loneliness she had glimpsed in Pierce's eyes, the way he had opened up to her even slightly during their journey. "I do not know, but I hope so." The days after her rescue passed in a blur of recovery. Theresa slept for nearly 24 hours straight, waking only to eat the meals Margaret brought to her room. When she finally emerged, feeling more herself, she threw herself into the work of the boarding house with new energy. Cleaning rooms, cooking meals, tending to the miners who came in dirty and exhausted from their claims. But through it all, her mind kept returning to Pierce. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. While kneading bread, she would remember the strength in his hands as he built their fire. While hanging laundry, she would recall the way he had draped his coat over her with such care. While treating a miner's cut hand, she would think of how Pierce had known exactly which plants were safe and which were poisonous. A week passed, then two. Buffalo settled back into its normal rhythms, and Theresa's adventure became just another story the townspeople told. But for her, it remained vivid, particularly the memory of blue-gray eyes watching her across a campfire. She began taking walks to the edge of town, looking up at the mountains and wondering where exactly Pierce's cabin was. 3 miles from where he found her, he had said, but she had no idea which direction. The mountains seemed impossibly vast, hiding their secrets and the people who chose to live among them. "You are pining," Margaret observed one evening as they sat on the porch shelling peas for the next day's stew. "I am not pining," Theresa protested, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. "You are. You get this look on your face, all dreamy and distant. And you keep staring at the mountains like they hold the answers to life's mysteries." Theresa sighed. "Is it foolish? I barely know him. We spent less than a day together." "Sometimes a day is enough to recognize something important," Margaret said wisely. "Your uncle and I knew within an hour of meeting that we would marry. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind has not yet accepted. But he lives in the mountains like a hermit. He does not want company or complications. Or he has been hurt so badly he is afraid to want those things," Margaret suggested. "War does terrible things to men, Theresa. Some come back in body but leave parts of themselves on the battlefield. Maybe Pierce just needs a reason to want to be whole again." The words stayed with Theresa as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Could she be that reason? Did she want to be? The answer came easily, yes. In the short time she had spent with Pierce, she had glimpsed something in him that called to something in her. A fundamental goodness, a strength that was not just physical but ran deep into his character. He had saved her life without expecting anything in return, had kept her safe through the night, had walked her home when he could have simply pointed the direction. And there had been moments, brief but meaningful, when she had seen the loneliness in his eyes mirror her own. When he had opened up about the war, about choosing simplicity over normalcy, she had recognized a kindred spirit. Someone else who had lost things and was trying to figure out how to build a new life. The question was what to do about it. She could wait and hope he came to town, but Pierce had made it clear he avoided civilization as much as possible. Or she could do something about it herself. The idea took root slowly, growing over the next few days until Theresa knew what she had to do. She approached Margaret one morning after the breakfast dishes were cleared. "Aunt Margaret, I need to learn about herbs, properly I mean. I want to know what to look for, where to find it, how to prepare it." Margaret looked surprised but pleased. "I think that is a wonderful idea. We use a great deal of herbal medicine here, and it would be useful to have another person who knows what they are doing." They spent the next week on Theresa's education. Margaret had books, detailed illustrations of various plants and their uses. They went through the herbs already hanging to dry in the larder, Margaret explaining each one's properties. Feverfew for headaches and fevers, yarrow for wounds and bleeding, chamomile for digestive troubles and anxiety, echinacea for infections. The list went on, and Theresa absorbed it all with intense focus. "You are a quick study," Margaret observed approvingly. "Much better than when I tried to teach you basic cooking." Theresa laughed. "I am motivated. I do not want to get lost again, but I also want to be useful. If I am going to live in Colorado, I should know the land." It was not the whole truth, but it was enough of it to satisfy Margaret. The real truth was that Theresa wanted an excuse to go back into the mountains, to perhaps cross paths with Pierce again in a way that seemed natural rather than desperate. If she was gathering herbs, she had a legitimate reason to be on the trails, especially if she stayed closer to town this time. 3 weeks after her rescue, Theresa set out early one morning with a proper basket, a map Margaret had drawn, and detailed instructions on where to find various medicinal plants. This time she was prepared with a water skin, food wrapped in cloth, and even a small compass one of the miners had lent her. She would not make the same mistakes again. The morning was beautiful, late September sliding into early October, the aspens turning gold and shimmering in the breeze. Theresa followed a well-marked trail that led up into the foothills, stopping periodically to gather the plants Margaret had indicated. She found yarrow growing in sunny patches, its feathery leaves and white flower clusters exactly as pictured in the books. She located wild bergamot and gathered the leaves carefully, their citrus scent refreshing. She worked her way higher, consulting the map frequently, always aware of her surroundings in a way she had not been that first disastrous trip. The hours passed pleasantly, her basket filling with useful plants, and she was just thinking she should start heading back when she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. Theresa froze, her heart suddenly pounding. She was still on trails that were relatively well-traveled, not deep enough in the wilderness to be on anyone's private land, but the sound was coming from somewhere off the main path. Curiosity warred with caution, and curiosity won. She carefully made her way toward the sound, moving through the trees until she spotted a clearing ahead. And there, working with steady rhythm to split logs, was Pierce. He had removed his shirt despite the cool temperature, and Theresa's breath caught at the sight of him. She had known he was powerfully built, but seeing him like this, muscles rippling with every swing of the axe, sweat gleaming on his tanned skin, was something else entirely. He looked like some ancient god of the forest, all raw masculine power and grace. She must have made some sound because Pierce's head whipped around, the axe coming up defensively before he recognized her. Then his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for her to identify before settling on surprise. "Theresa, what are you doing up here?" She stepped into the clearing, suddenly self-conscious under his intense gaze. "Gathering herbs. My aunt has been teaching me properly this time." She held up her basket as evidence. "I stayed on the trail. I have a map and compass, and I checked the sun position twice to make sure I know which direction is home." The corner of Pierce's mouth twitched. "So you learned your lesson." "I am a fast learner when the lesson nearly kills me." Theresa moved closer, unable to help herself. "This is your land. Your cabin." Pierce nodded, gesturing with the axe toward a structure partially hidden by trees. Theresa could see it now, a well-built log cabin with a stone chimney, larger than she had expected and clearly made with skill. "Winter is coming. I need to prepare. May I see?" The question came out before Theresa could consider whether it was appropriate. "The cabin, I mean, if that is acceptable." Pierce hesitated, clearly torn. Then he set down the axe and pulled his shirt back on, much to Theresa's mixed disappointment and relief. "I suppose you did come all this way, and you look like you could use water before heading back." He led her toward the cabin, and as they got closer, Theresa could see more details. There was a small garden area, now mostly harvested but showing evidence of careful tending. A shed for storing wood and tools. A lean-to that probably housed a horse or mule, though it was empty at the moment. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately, who took pride in his home even if he shared it with no one. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly tidy and comfortable. One main room with a stone fireplace, a well-made bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves holding books and supplies. A ladder led up to what looked like a storage loft. The walls were chinked tight against the weather and various pelts hung on stretchers, evidence of Pierce's trapping work. "You built all this yourself?" Theresa asked, genuinely impressed. "Over several years," Pierce confirmed. "It keeps improving as I learn better techniques." He poured water from a bucket into 2 cups and handed one to her. "But you did not come looking for me to discuss carpentry." Theresa took a sip of the cold, clean water, buying herself time to think. Had she come looking for him? Yes, though she had not quite admitted it to herself until now. "I wanted to thank you again," she said carefully. "And I suppose I wanted to see you again, to know you are real and not just some mountain spirit I imagined while I was lost." Pierce studied her, his blue-gray eyes searching her face. "I am real. Just a man, nothing special. You saved my life. That seems fairly special to me. Any decent person would have done the same. I think we both know that is not true." Theresa set down her cup and moved closer to him, drawn by something she could not quite name. "Pierce, may I ask you something?" "You can ask. I may not answer." "In the forest, when we were walking out, you said something about wondering if simple was the same as good. What did you mean?" Pierce was quiet for a long moment, and Theresa thought he would not answer. Then he sighed, running a hand through his long hair. "I came up here 8 years ago because I could not stand being around people, could not stand their questions, their pity, their noise. I thought if I could just be alone, be simple, I could find peace." He paused, looking around his cabin. "And I have found peace, mostly. But lately I have been wondering if I found peace or if I just found emptiness." The admission clearly cost him, and Theresa felt honored that he trusted her with it. "What changed?" His eyes met hers, and there was something raw in them that made her breath catch. "You did. Tracking you, talking to you, watching you be brave even though you were terrified. It reminded me that people can be complicated and still be good. That maybe isolation is not the same as healing." Theresa's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "And what are you going to do with that reminder?" "I do not know," Pierce said honestly. "I have been alone a long time. I am not sure I remember how to be any other way." She took another step closer until they were almost touching, her head tilted back to look up at his face. Maybe you could try. Maybe you could come to town more often. Visit the boarding house. Let me show you that people can be worthwhile. Or I could ruin what I have found, Pierce countered, but his voice was gentler now. Get attached to something and lose it again. I do not know if I could survive that. Or you could live, Theresa said softly. Really live, not just exist. I know about loss, Pierce. I lost my parents, my home, everything I knew. Coming here was terrifying. But I did it because the alternative was hiding away and letting fear win. And yes, I got lost and nearly died, but I also found something. She reached up and laid her hand against his bearded cheek. I found you. Pierce closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved for gentleness. Theresa, you barely know me. Then let me know you better. Let me come visit, bring you meals, talk with you. Let me show you that you do not have to choose between peace and people. When he opened his eyes again, they were full of longing and fear and hope all mixed together. I do not know how to do this, how to let someone in. We will figure it out together, Theresa promised, if you are willing to try. For a long moment, Pierce just looked at her, his large hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his face. Then, slowly, carefully, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle and hesitant, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how to be tender but was willing to remember. Theresa rose on her toes, pressing closer, and felt Pierce's arms come around her, strong and sure. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, and Theresa felt warmth flooding through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. I am going to disappoint you, he said quietly. I am going to be difficult and stubborn and bad at this. Probably, Theresa agreed, making him huff out a surprised laugh. But I am going to be impulsive and talkative and push you out of your comfort zone, so I suppose we are even. This is a terrible idea, Pierce said, but he was smiling now, a real smile that transformed his entire face. The best ideas usually are. Theresa kissed him again, quick and sure. Now walk me back to town before my aunt sends a search party, and this time, promise me you will come visit soon. I promise, Pierce said, and Theresa could hear in his voice that he meant it. They made the walk back to Buffalo together, taking their time, talking about everything and nothing. Pierce told her about his life in the mountains, the animals he encountered, the changing seasons, the satisfaction of living by his own hands. Theresa told him about Philadelphia, about her parents, about adjusting to life in a rough mining town where she knew no one. They traded stories and opinions and dreams, and by the time they reached the boarding house, Theresa felt like she knew him better than people she had known for years. When will I see you again? She asked as they stood on the porch, aware of curious eyes watching from the windows. 3 days, Pierce said. I need to check my trap lines, but then I will come. If your aunt will have me for dinner, she will be thrilled. Theresa squeezed his hand. Thank you for letting me in. I know it was not easy. Pierce raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that felt almost courtly. Thank you for being worth letting in. He left then, striding back toward the mountains with that same powerful grace, and Theresa watched until he disappeared from view. When she finally turned to go inside, she found Margaret waiting with an expression that was equal parts amused and concerned. So, her aunt said, that looked promising. It is complicated, Theresa hedged. The best things usually are. Come inside and tell me everything. And I mean everything, young lady. Over tea and fresh bread, Theresa told her aunt about finding Pierce at his cabin, about their conversation and the tentative agreement to try building something together. Margaret listened without interrupting, her shrewd eyes taking in every detail. He is carrying a lot of pain, Margaret observed when Theresa finished. War trauma is not something that heals easily or quickly. I know, but I think he wants to heal now. He just needs someone patient enough to let him do it at his own pace. And you think you can be that patient?" Theresa considered the question seriously. "I think I can try. He is worth it, Aunt Margaret. There is something good in him, something strong and decent that survived the war intact. He just needs help remembering it is there." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her niece's hand. "Then I will support you in this. But Theresa, be careful with your own heart too. Sometimes we love people who cannot love us back the way we need, not because they do not want to, but because they do not know how." "I understand, but I have to try." 3 days later, as promised, Pierce appeared at the boarding house just as Margaret was setting out dinner for her boarders. He had cleaned up, his hair neatly tied back and his beard trimmed, wearing what Theresa suspected were his best clothes. He looked uncomfortable but determined, and her heart swelled with affection for him. The dinner was loud and chaotic, the boarding house full of miners fresh from their claims, all of them curious about the mountain man who had rescued Theresa. Pierce handled their questions with more patience than she had expected, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally flickered toward the door as if contemplating escape. When the meal ended, and most of the boarders had dispersed, Pierce visibly relaxed. He helped Theresa and Margaret clear the table without being asked, his large hands gentle with the dishes. Then Margaret tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone in the kitchen. "That was not so bad," Theresa observed, washing dishes while Pierce dried. "It was loud," Pierce said, but there was amusement in his voice. "I had forgotten how loud people are when there are many of them together." "Too loud," he considered the question. "Overwhelming, but not unbearable, though I do not think I could do that every night. No one is asking you to. But maybe once a week. Come for dinner, spend time with me, slowly get used to people again." Pierce nodded. "I can try that, though I am much better at being alone in the wilderness than making small talk about mining claims." "Then we will take walks instead," Theresa suggested. "You can teach me more about the mountains, about plants and animals and survival. I want to learn, and you clearly love teaching when it is something you know about." Over the next weeks, they fell into a pattern. Pierce would come to town twice a week, once for dinner at the boarding house and once to take Theresa on long walks through the foothills. On their walks, he opened up in ways he clearly could not around crowds, telling her about his childhood in Missouri, about the brother he lost at Shiloh, about the years he spent wandering before finding his mountain cabin. Theresa listened and shared her own stories, and slowly they built something real between them. Pierce taught her to read animal tracks and identify edible plants. He showed her how to move quietly through the forest and how to find her way by the stars. In return, she brought him back to the world of people with gentle persistence, dragging him to town socials and church services, introducing him to Buffalo's residents, until he was no longer just the hermit mountain man but Pierce, someone with a place in the community. The first snow fell in early November, dusting the mountains white and making Buffalo hunker down for winter. Pierce came to the boarding house more often now, helping Margaret with repairs and heavy work in exchange for meals. He was still uncomfortable around crowds, but less so, and Theresa noticed him starting to relax into conversations, even occasionally making jokes that surprised laughter out of the miners. One evening as they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, Pierce said, "I am not good at this yet." "At what?" "This, us, being part of something." He gestured vaguely at the boarding house, the town beyond. "But I am trying." "I know you are," Theresa said softly, taking his hand, "and you are doing better than you think." Pierce turned to look at her, his blue-gray eyes serious. "I need to tell you something. When I found you in the forest that day, I almost walked away." Theresa felt her heart clench. "Why did you not?" "Because you were gathering herbs. Such a simple, hopeful thing, trying to help your aunt even though you were clearly terrified and lost. It reminded me that people do good things, small things, things that matter. And I thought maybe if I could save one person, it would balance out some of the people I could not save in the war." He paused. "I did not expect that person to save me back." "Pierce," Theresa whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I have spent 8 years hiding from life because I was afraid of being hurt again. But you make me want to be brave. You make me remember that life is worth living, even with the pain." He reached up and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. "I am falling in love with you, Theresa Jenkins. And it terrifies me, but I do not want to stop." Joy burst through Theresa like sunrise. "I am already in love with you," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I have been since you draped your coat over me that first night and kept watch so I could sleep safely." Pierce kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Theresa felt the last of his walls crumbling. When they broke apart, he was smiling, that rare, transformative smile that made him look years younger. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we figure out how to build a life together," Theresa said. "Maybe you move closer to town, or maybe I learn to love the mountains the way you do. Maybe both. We have time to figure it out." "I would like that," Pierce said. "Time with you, a future with you." They sat together as snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting down to dust their hair and shoulders, and Theresa thought about how strange life was. A month and a half ago she had been lost and terrified, certain she would die alone in the wilderness. Now she was found, loved, planning a future with a man who had been equally lost until they found each other. As winter deepened, their relationship deepened with it. Pierce spent more time in Buffalo, eventually renting a small cabin on the edge of town, so he had somewhere to stay during his visits. But he kept his mountain cabin too, and Theresa began spending time there, learning to love the peace and beauty of the high country. Margaret watched their courtship with approval, seeing how they balanced each other. Pierce grounded Theresa, teaching her patience and care. Theresa brought Pierce back to life, reminding him how to laugh and hope and plan for a future beyond simple survival. Spring came early in 1877, the snow melting to reveal green shoots and wildflowers. Pierce proposed to Theresa on a hillside covered in columbines, dropping to one knee and offering her a ring he had traded a winter's worth of furs to afford. She said yes, before he even finished asking, throwing her arms around his neck and nearly knocking him over in her enthusiasm. They were married in late May at the little church in Buffalo, with half the town in attendance. Pierce looked uncomfortable in his new suit, but his eyes never left Theresa as she walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, carrying wildflowers they had gathered together from the mountains. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Pierce kissed her with such tenderness that several of the miners' wives dabbed at their eyes. The boarding house hosted the reception, Margaret outdoing herself with food and decorations. Pierce endured the celebration with good grace, though Theresa could see his relief when they finally escaped to the small cabin he had rented, which would serve as their home while they decided where to settle permanently. "Hello, husband," Theresa said as Pierce carried her over the threshold, a tradition she had insisted on despite his grumbling. "Hello, wife," Pierce replied, setting her down gently and looking at her like she was something precious and fragile. "I still cannot believe you chose this, chose me." "I chose you the moment you offered to walk me out of those mountains," Theresa said, reaching up to loosen his collar. "Everything after that was just details." They spent their wedding night learning each other in new ways. Pierce's initial uncertainty giving way to passion and tenderness that left them both breathless. In the quiet afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Theresa felt complete in a way she never had before. "I was thinking," Pierce said, his deep voice rumbling in his chest where her head rested, "we could build a new cabin. Somewhere between here and my mountain place. Close enough to town that you can help your aunt, far enough out that I do not feel crowded. We could plant a bigger garden, maybe get some chickens, build a real home." "I would love that," Theresa said. "Teach me how to build a cabin, how to live off the land the way you do. I want to share all of it with you." Over the next year, that is exactly what they did. Pierce found perfect land about 2 miles from Buffalo, with good water and southern exposure, and they began building. The miners from the boarding house helped, eager to repay Pierce for the times he had guided them through difficult mountain passes or tracked down their lost pack animals. Margaret contributed furniture and household goods, delighted to see her niece so happy. The cabin that emerged was beautiful, larger than Pierce's mountain retreat but still cozy, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above. Pierce crafted the furniture with his own hands, each piece made with care and skill. Theresa planted an extensive garden and herb beds, using everything Margaret had taught her and everything Pierce knew about which plants thrived in mountain soil. By the time their first anniversary arrived, they had a true home. And more than that, they had built a life that combined the best of both their worlds. Pierce still trapped in the winter and occasionally took extended trips into the mountains, but he always came home to Theresa. She continued helping Margaret at the boarding house, but she had also become known in Buffalo as someone skilled with herbal remedies, tending to minor injuries and illnesses throughout the town. The summer of 1878 brought news that made them both nervous and excited. Theresa was pregnant. Pierce became even more protective than usual, fussing over her in ways that were both endearing and exasperating. He reinforced everything in the cabin that might possibly be unsafe, stockpiled enough firewood to last 2 winters, and generally drove Theresa to affectionate distraction with his worrying. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one evening when he tried to prevent her from lifting a water bucket. "You are carrying my child," Pierce replied, taking the bucket from her anyway. "I am allowed to worry." "You are allowed to be reasonable," Theresa countered, but she was smiling. She understood his fear, knew he was terrified of losing her the way he had lost so many others. "I am healthy and strong, and I have Margaret to help. Everything will be fine." In February of 1879, during a snowstorm that temporarily isolated their cabin from town, Theresa went into labor. Pierce had never been more terrified in his life, not even during the war, but he stayed calm for her sake, doing everything he could to help. When Margaret had taught him about assisting with childbirth during the pregnancy, he had paid careful attention, never imagining he might actually need the knowledge. But he did need it, because the baby came fast, and there was no time to get to town. Pierce found himself catching his own son as the child entered the world, his large hands impossibly gentle as he held the tiny, squalling infant. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion as he carefully cleaned and wrapped his son before placing him in Theresa's arms. "We have a son." Theresa looked down at the baby, tears streaming down her exhausted face, and then up at Pierce with so much love it made his chest ache. What should we name him? Pierce thought of his brother, lost at Shiloh so many years ago. "Thomas," he said quietly. "For your uncle who built a life here before us, and for my brother who never got the chance to build one at all." "Thomas Jameson," Theresa agreed. "It is perfect." As Pierce sat beside his wife and newborn son, watching the snow fall outside their warm cabin, He thought about the path that had brought him here, the war that had broken him, the mountains that had sheltered him, the lost young woman gathering herbs who had reminded him how to be human again. Every terrible thing, every lonely year had been worth it to arrive at this moment. "I love you," he told Theresa, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for finding me in those mountains." "I think you found me," Theresa said with a tired smile. "Maybe we found each other." The years that followed were full and happy. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who loved the mountains as much as his father, learning to track and hunt and read the weather. 2 years after Thomas came a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after her great aunt and the wild roses that grew around their cabin. And 3 years after that, another son they named Samuel, after the miner whose guilt over Theresa getting lost had eventually led to friendship with Pierce. Pierce never entirely lost his preference for quiet and solitude, but he learned to balance it with family and community. He became known throughout the area as someone who could find lost travelers, who knew the mountains better than anyone, and was willing to help those in need. Several times a year, someone would come to his cabin asking for help tracking a missing person or finding safe passage through difficult terrain, and Pierce never refused. Theresa became the town's unofficial healer, her knowledge of herbs and medicine growing with every year. She trained other women interested in the healing arts, passing on everything Margaret had taught her and everything she had learned from Pierce about mountain plants. The boarding house remained in the family, with Margaret eventually turning most of the daily management over to a younger cousin who came west in 1883. In 1885, Buffalo finally got a proper doctor, a young man fresh from medical school in the East who was fascinated by Theresa's knowledge of herbal remedies. They formed an unlikely partnership, combining his book learning with her practical experience to serve the growing town better than either could alone. Through it all, Pierce and Theresa's love deepened and matured. They had arguments, of course, moments when Pierce's stubbornness clashed with Theresa's impulsiveness, times when his need for quiet conflicted with her love of people. But they always worked through it, their commitment to each other and the life they had built together stronger than any temporary disagreement. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, their children playing in the yard, and Pierce would take Theresa's hand and remember the lost young woman he had found gathering herbs 8 years before. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one such evening. "Choosing this life, choosing me?" Theresa looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Not for one single moment, do you?" "Never. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had walked away that day, if I had decided it was not my problem." "Then we both would have died," Theresa said simply. "Me in the forest, you in your mountain cabin, maybe not physically, but in every way that matters. We saved each other, Pierce. That is what love does." He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and sunshine that always clung to her. "I am glad you got lost that day." "So am I," Theresa agreed. "Getting lost led me home." As the years rolled on, Buffalo grew from a rough mining settlement into a proper town with schools and churches and businesses. Pierce and Theresa grew older along with it, their children growing up and starting families of their own. Thomas took over much of his father's guide work, knowing the mountains almost as well as Pierce did. Margaret Rose married the doctor's son and continued her mother's healing work. Samuel, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, bringing education to mountain communities that had none. Pierce's hair turned silver, matching his beard, and his body bore the marks of years of hard work and mountain living. But he remained strong and capable, still taking trips into the high country even as he moved into his 50s. Theresa's blonde hair gained threads of white, and laugh lines crinkled around her eyes, evidence of a life well lived and much enjoyed. Margaret lived to see her niece's children grown, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1892 at the age of 73. The entire town turned out for her funeral, testament to the difference one kind woman running a boarding house had made in a rough frontier settlement. Pierce carried her coffin with 5 other men, honoring the woman who had welcomed him into her home and treated him like family. "She gave me a place to belong," Pierce told Theresa after the funeral, "when I did not think I could belong anywhere anymore." "She saw what I saw," Theresa said, linking her arm through his. "A good man who just needed someone to believe in him." In 1895, Colorado celebrated its 19th anniversary of statehood, and Buffalo organized a celebration. Pierce, now 50 years old, participated in his first town event without Theresa having to drag him there. He stood with other town founders, sharing stories of the early days, and realized with some surprise that he had become one of Buffalo's respected citizens. The hermit mountain man who had avoided people for so long was now someone the community looked up to, someone young families came to for advice about surviving mountain winters and building lasting homes. That night, lying in bed in the cabin they had built together 20 years before, Pierce said, "I never thought I would have this." "This?" Theresa asked, snuggling closer to him. "Family. Home. A place in the world. After the war, I thought I was broken beyond repair. I truly believed the best I could hope for was to survive until I died. And now I know I was not broken, just wounded, and wounds can heal if you give them the right care." He kissed the top of her head. "You were the right care, Theresa. You healed me just by loving me." "You healed me too," Theresa said. "I was lost in more ways than one when you found me. Lost in grief, lost in fear, lost trying to figure out where I belonged. You showed me that home is not a place but a person." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, just as they had every night for 18 years, and Pierce dreamed of mountains and herbs, and a young woman with dirt on her dress and hope in her eyes. The new century arrived with excitement and change. Buffalo had electric lights now, and talk of bringing in telephone lines. Young Thomas had 3 children of his own, and he brought them to visit their grandparents regularly, the little ones delighting in hearing stories of the old days when their grandmother got lost and their grandfather found her. "Tell us again about the bear, Grandpa," the oldest would beg, and Pierce would patiently explain for the 100th time that there had not actually been a bear, though there could have been because bears were common in those mountains. "Tell us about Grandma eating the berries," another would demand, and Theresa would laugh and describe her terror at not knowing if they were poisonous. "Tell us about the herbs," the youngest always asked, because she was particularly fascinated by her grandmother's healing work. They told the stories, over and over, because they were the story of how their family began, of how 2 lost people found each other and built something beautiful from their brokenness. In the spring of 1902, Pierce and Theresa celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the town hall, and it seemed like half of Colorado showed up. People whose lives they had touched, people Pierce had guided through the mountains, people Theresa had healed, families they had helped in countless small ways over the decades. The outpouring of love and respect overwhelmed them both. Who knew the hermit would become the most popular man in town? Theresa teased as they danced together, Pierce still moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "I had a good teacher," Pierce replied, pulling her closer. "She taught me that people are worth the trouble." "Most people," Theresa corrected. "Some people are just trouble." Pierce laughed. the sound rich and warm, so different from the man he had been 26 years ago when he found a lost young woman gathering herbs in his forest. That man had been hollow, going through the motions of survival without truly living. This man, the one who danced with his wife in front of half the town, was whole. They were whole together. As they moved into their later years, Pierce and Theresa settled into a comfortable rhythm. They spent summers in their cabin, tending an enormous garden and hosting visits from children and grandchildren. Winters they moved to town, staying in rooms Margaret had left to Theresa in her will, helping however they could with the boarding house and community needs. Pierce still took occasional trips into the mountains, though shorter now, and Theresa still made her remedies, training a new generation of healers. On a bright September day in 1907, Pierce and Theresa hiked up to the place where he had first found her. It was something they did every year on the anniversary of her rescue, a tradition that kept the memory fresh and reminded them how far they had come. The forest looked much as it had 3 decades before, eternal and unchanging in the way only mountains can be. "I was right over there," Theresa said, pointing to a spot near a large pine, "crying and lost and certain I was going to die." "And I was standing here," Pierce said, moving to the tree where he had first observed her, "trying to decide if I should help or just point you toward town and leave." "I am glad you chose to help. So am I. Best decision I ever made." They sat together on a fallen log, holding hands and watching the afternoon light filter through the golden aspens. At 60 and 55 respectively, they were both feeling their age, but they were healthy and happy, surrounded by family and purpose. "If you could go back," Theresa asked, "and tell that younger version of yourself, the broken soldier hiding in the mountains, that this is where he would end up, do you think he would believe you?" Pierce considered the question seriously. "No, he would have thought it was impossible, that he did not deserve it and could not achieve it even if he did. And now I know that broken things can be mended, that healing takes time and patience and love, but it is possible. That sometimes the best things come from the worst moments if we are brave enough to try." He brought her hand to his lips. "You made me brave, Theresa. You were always brave. You just needed a reason to use it for something other than survival." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose, they made their way back down to the cabin. Their steps were slower than they once were, but they were still steady, still sure. Behind them, the forest whispered its approval, the mountains keeping their secrets and their promises, eternal witnesses to a love story that began with being lost and ended with being found. Over the following years, they watched Buffalo transform from a frontier town into a modern community. Their grandchildren grew up, and several moved away to Denver or Colorado Springs, seeking opportunities in the cities. But many stayed, drawn to the mountains and the life their grandparents had pioneered. Pierce's reputation as someone who knew the mountains better than anyone meant that even in his 60s, people sought his advice on everything from where to build to how to track lost livestock. Thomas took over most of the active guide work, but Pierce still consulted on difficult cases. In 1910, when a group of tourists from New York got lost in a late-season blizzard, it was Pierce's knowledge that directed the search party to find them before they froze. At 63, he could not make the climb himself anymore, but his mind remained sharp, his understanding of the mountains unmatched. Theresa's healing work became even more valuable as she aged. The doctor who had partnered with her years ago brought in younger physicians, all of whom recognized the value of her knowledge. She began writing down her remedies and techniques, creating a comprehensive guide to mountain herbs and their uses that would be published after her death and used by healers throughout Colorado. In 1912, as they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset, Pierce said, "We should write it all down, our story, for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so they know where they came from." Theresa smiled. "You mean so they know how their grandfather saved their very foolish grandmother? So they know that getting lost sometimes leads you exactly where you need to be," Pierce corrected. "So they know that broken people can heal and build beautiful lives. So they know that love is worth every risk." They spent the winter of 1912 writing their story, taking turns with the pen, arguing good-naturedly about details and laughing over memories. Pierce wrote about the war, honestly and painfully, giving his descendants a window into what he had survived. Theresa wrote about losing her parents and the fear of starting over in a strange land. Together they wrote about finding each other, about building a life and a family, about learning that home is something you create with the people you love. When they finished, they had a leather-bound book full of their story, their history, their love. They gave copies to each of their children, and years later, their descendants would treasure these books as precious family heirlooms. The summer of 1915 found Pierce slowing down noticeably. At 68, his body was finally admitting it could not do everything it once had. His knees ached in cold weather, and the old war wound in his shoulder bothered him more than it used to. But his spirit remained strong, his love for Theresa as powerful as ever. They spent that summer much as they had spent every summer, in their cabin with visits from family, tending the garden and enjoying the peace of the mountains. But there was a sweetness to it, a sense of time being precious, that had not been there before. On a warm August evening, sitting on the porch as they had countless times before, Pierce said, "I have had a good life, Theresa, better than I ever thought possible." "We have," Theresa agreed, holding his hand. "We have been blessed." "If I go first," Pierce continued, ignoring her protest, "I want you to know that every single day with you was worth living for. You gave me back my life. You gave me love and family and purpose. You made me whole." Tears streamed down Theresa's face. "Please do not talk about leaving me." "We are not young anymore, love. We have to talk about these things." Pierce pulled her close. "But know this. Even death cannot undo what we built. Our children carry us forward. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will tell our story. The love we shared will echo through generations." "I know," Theresa whispered, "but I am not ready to let you go." "I am not planning to go anywhere yet," Pierce assured her. "I still have years of annoying you ahead of me." And he did. Pierce lived another 7 years, seeing the end of the Great War and the beginning of the 1920s. He met 2 great-great-grandchildren and watched Buffalo install its first automobile service station. He saw women gain the right to vote and Colorado fully modernize. Through it all, Theresa was at his side, his constant companion and greatest love. When Pierce finally passed in the spring of 1922, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the cabin he had built with his own hands, with Theresa holding him. He was 75 years old and had lived a long, full life far beyond what the broken soldier who came to these mountains in 1868 could have imagined. The entire town mourned him. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including people who had traveled from across Colorado to pay their respects to the mountain man who had helped so many over the decades. His children and grandchildren spoke of his strength, his wisdom, his unfailing love for family. And Theresa, though her heart was breaking, spoke of how he had saved her life and then spent the next 45 years making that life worth living. After Pierce's death, many people expected Theresa to fade quickly, as sometimes happens with couples who have been together so long. But Theresa had learned strength from Pierce, and she carried on. She continued her healing work, continued writing down remedies and techniques, continued being a grandmother and great-grandmother. She lived in their cabin during summers and in town during winters, surrounded by family and purpose. She would sit on her porch on summer evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, and talk to Pierce as if he were still there. She would tell him about their great-great-grandchildren, about changes in the town, about the herbs growing in their garden. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the pines in just the right way, she could almost hear him answering. Theresa lived another 8 years, passing peacefully in 1930 at the age of 82. She died in her sleep in the cabin she and Pierce had built, surrounded by 4 generations of family. Her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me at the tree where we met." They buried her next to Pierce in the Buffalo Cemetery under a simple stone that read, "Pierce and Theresa Jenkins. He found her lost in the mountains. She found him lost in life. Together they found home." Their story became legend in Buffalo and the surrounding mountains. The cabin they built was preserved by their descendants and eventually became a historical site, a testament to frontier love and resilience. The herbal remedy book Theresa wrote was published and reprinted multiple times, used by healers and historians studying frontier medicine. Pierce's knowledge of the mountains was passed down through his son Thomas and Thomas's children, becoming part of the accumulated wisdom that helped the region thrive. But more than any of that, their love story endured. Parents told it to children, grandparents to grandchildren. A tale of 2 broken people who found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful. It became a reminder that sometimes getting lost is the first step to being found, that broken things can heal, and that love is always worth the risk. In the mountains above Buffalo, the forests still grow thick, and the aspens still turn gold in September. And on quiet evenings, when the light slants just right through the trees, some people swear they can see them. A large man with silver hair and a woman with bright eyes, walking hand in hand through the wilderness they both loved, together forever in the place where they found each other and themselves. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Colorado, many of them in or near Buffalo. They hike the same trails Pierce and Theresa walked, gather herbs from the same mountains, and tell the story of how their family began with a young woman lost in the forest and a mountain man brave enough to not just walk her out, but to let her walk into his heart. It is a story of rescue and healing, of courage and love, of 2 people who saved each other and built a legacy that would last generations. And every year, on a bright September day, their descendants gather at the place where Pierce first found Theresa gathering herbs. They bring wildflowers and tell the old stories, teaching the youngest ones about the great-great-grandparents who proved that love can heal even the deepest wounds. That home is built not from logs and stone but from commitment and care. And that sometimes the best journeys begin by getting completely and utterly lost. The mountains remember, eternal and unchanging, keeping watch over the town and the people who built their lives in the shadow of the peaks. And in the whisper of wind through pine trees, in the rustle of aspen leaves turning gold, in the crystal clarity of mountain streams, Pierce and Theresa's story lives on, a testament to the transformative power of love and the truth that sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely before we can truly be found.